Great. I think we're getting close to a good number, so I'm going to make a start for us, I think. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Christians on the Left Faith in Aid event with the Shadow International Development Secretary, Preet Gill, the Member of Parliament for Birmingham and Edgbaston, in collaboration with World Vision, Tearfund, Islamic Relief and Christian Aid. I'm delighted to be joined on the panel by Tufail Hussain, Mark Sheard, Dr. Ruth Valerio and Patrick Watt. My name is Heather Staff and I'm the Secretary for Christians on the Left and the Chair of the Labour Campaign for International Development. Christians on the Left exist to gather, inspire, equip and encourage people who are on the left of British politics. We're an affiliate of Labour and a bridge between the party and also churches in the UK. Several years ago, I was actually attending one of my first Christians on the Left events in Parliament on Fireworks Night, although in very different circumstances to tonight. And I'm delighted to now be chairing tonight's session again on Fireworks Night. Please don't be alarmed if you hear any loud bangs in the background. We're currently having somewhat of an Islington fireworks display outside, so hopefully that will end quite soon. Last year, we did have a very successful event with Preet at Party Conference, and I'm delighted that she has agreed to come back to us, albeit sadly via Zoom and at the start of a second lockdown, rather than in person. Just some ground rules. Everyone apart from panel members should be on mute, but please feel free to type your questions in the chat. I think they'll come directly to myself and I will go through them at the end. We will first hear from Preet, then an introduction from the panel members, and then a fairly open discussion between our panel. Tonight, we are looking at Build Back Better. How can Labour work towards post-COVID global solidarity? COVID-19 has shown us just how interconnected our world is. Our society's pre-existing inequalities have been exacerbated, and the gap between rich and poor has become wider. As the world grapples with how and if to build back better following the pandemic, faith agencies have come together to suggest the ways in which the UK and Labour particularly can contribute to the building of a better, fairer and more sustainable world. And with that in mind, I'm now delighted to welcome Preet Gill to set out Labour's vision for international development. So hopefully this will work, and I'm going to go straight over to Preet. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. And thank you, Heather, for setting the scene so clearly. And absolutely, last year at Labour Party Conference, I was lucky enough to take part in a Fringe event in St Paul's Church in Brighton, titled Faith in Aid. And while the event this year hasn't come with the same delicious spread of sandwiches and crisps, I'm sure we'll still have a good discussion, and it's really, truly an honour and a pleasure to be here tonight with you all. I want to just say thank you to Christians on the Left, to LCID and World Vision for your support in arranging tonight's event, and for Islamic Relief, Christian Aid and Tearfund for being here today, and for all of your work during the last 9 months, especially as primary and secondary impacts of COVID have been exacerbating existing inequalities. I also want to say a really big thank you to everyone who has joined us this evening. And against the backdrop of an unprecedented global health and economic crisis, the UK government has chosen to slash the aid budget, threaten to redirect ever more aid money to projects that do nothing to alleviate poverty, and they've abolished our world-leading development department, putting the UK's development policy and budget under a Secretary of State who has pretty much shown a disdain for much of the vital life-saving and life-changing work that the British public are really proud to support. All of this is done while allowing only the absolute minimum degree of public and parliamentary scrutiny for the actions and decisions made. Even consultations that were made are as far away from being real or meaningful as you can absolutely get. And all in all, this government have pretty much taken a hammer to the cross-party consensus on international development, a consensus which understood and protected a sense of moral duty based on our common humanity. Because when we come together to support those around us when they are in need, and was able to look beyond short-term, narrow definitions of public interest, and instead understood the practical and the pragmatic rationale that it is in the UK's national interest to exist and operate in a safer, fairer, and more secure and better world. In part, This has been pretty much a failure of politicians and organisations working on development, because we haven't talked to and convinced the public about the value and the real importance of our work. And under assault from wings of the Conservative Party during the 10 years of rule, there has been a real desire not to rock the boat too much. But unfortunately this year, we've seen the result with limited outcry over the decisions taken. The example I've been using in many of my discussions, and the one which I think in current company is especially relevant, is the outspoken and public criticism of the government by faith leaders following the breakdown of lockdown rules by Dominic Cummings. Where have they been as people around the world have suffered as a result of the government's inaction to respond to COVID-19 in the global south? Where have they been to defend the UK's hard-won position as a development superpower, which has lifted millions of people out of poverty and supported millions of children into education with access to basic healthcare, and helped eradicate diseases that we've all seen, like polio? The title of the event today is Build Back Better. How can Labour work towards post-COVID global solidarity? And I will discuss the work Labour can do in opposition to build that global post-COVID solidarity, how we can pressure the UK government and mobilise civil society now and for when we enter office. But we do need to think about what we can do now in opposition to limit the damage and destruction that the government has already shown in its first year. We are all strong when we speak out, when we show that global solidarity in our words and in our actions, and when we all make that collective case for a better world. The meetings I've had and the people I've met in the UK and around the world since becoming Shadow Minister for International Development in 2018, and then Shadow Secretary of State in April, gives me absolutely cause for hope that the support is absolutely out there. It's there in the regional events that I have done around the UK. It's there in when I speak to development colleagues around the world, and they are there in visits I've made, whether they're virtual or physical, to the global south. We have strong supporters. And so it was really welcome to hear David Attenborough end his most recent programme, A Life on Our Planet, with calls to tackle poverty, provide universal healthcare, improve girls' education, and tackle the climate crisis as key priorities to restore a balance between people and the world, and ensure that there is a planet where future generations can continue to thrive and to flourish. The solidarity that I believe in is about identifying and understanding the root causes of poverty and inequality. And then it's about challenging and changing them. This belief really for me was influenced by my parents and my family, and the fact that I grew up in the Sikh faith here in Birmingham with frequent trips back to our homeland in India. I know that this belief and understanding of a common humanity is reflected across all faiths in different ways. And I believe that it stems from a belief that poverty and inequality are not inevitable. They are not there by virtue of us being humans, but instead are highly political and exist because of decisions which have been made both 100 years ago and today. We know the impact of colonialism and deep scars that still strike the global south. And we know that today the wealth and power which has been concentrated as a result is being used to stockpile life-saving vaccines rather than guaranteeing equitable access to those who need it as quickly as possible. We also know that we will only be safe when everyone is safe. And that's why I've been working with Labour's health and BASE teams to pressure the government from various angles to play their part as major donors to the WHO and to Gavi, and to use their influence to push for genuinely equitable access to COVID-19 tools and technologies. Meanwhile, tax avoidance and illicit financial flows deny many countries in the global south hundreds of billions every year, meaning that they do not have the necessary resources to invest in services that their citizens need. And now, in the midst of a global pandemic, when many of the world's poorest countries are crying out for a long-term sustainable solution to a looming debt crisis, the G20 is pretty much offering the bare minimum of action and merely resorting to strong words to encourage private creditors to suspend rather than cancel debt repayments. It's been really great to have been working with the Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, drawing inspiration from the precedent that was set during the previous global financial crisis to urge the UK government to tackle the international debt crisis in the global south, including unilateral action to amend English law to temporarily limit the ability of private creditors to sue for debt recovery for 74 of the countries covered by the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. It's only by leveraging our unique position as a global financial centre whose law governs vast amounts of international debt that the UK can show the global leadership that this crisis demands. And we have seen the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women, on girls, from education to gender-based violence. And whilst the Prime Minister has talked about the importance of girls' education and preventing sexual violence in conflict initiative, the rhetoric has pretty much not been matched by the action. And I have to say that the commitment is shallow. And for the latter, the Independent Commission for Aid found that while the summit to kick off PSVI gave us all great hope, little of the promise has been fulfilled. There's been no detailed pledges, and actually there's been no overall strategy. And while for the former, development spending on primary education has also been cut by more than 27% this year, and programmes are being cancelled and postponed that would enable so many girls to have a safe education, such as the one investing in adolescent girls in Rwanda. I also want to take this opportunity to talk about safeguarding. Many organisations and governments bring jobs, they bring resources, and financial or otherwise, and this creates, and we have to accept this, it creates a power imbalance which allows for abuse and exploitation. And while there are adequate systems for monitoring and reporting are vital for survivors, the NGO sector and the international institutions and bodies working with vulnerable people need to look at and champion deeper cultural change, which seeks to address this as a way of addressing sexual exploitation and abuse in the long term. And we must all work together to address this. We have also seen the fragility of health systems to cope with the impacts of the pandemic. And is it any wonder when countries like the UK have focused on privatisation of public services rather than using the NHS as a template for healthcare that is genuinely universal and something that everybody should have the right to access? If we are going to support people around the world, then we need to work with governments in the global south. We need to work with civil society groups, trade unions, activists, and citizens, because we have to work together to alter power structures that lead to that exploitation and discrimination. And we must listen to drive the redistribution of power and resources, because only through pursuing these will we actually see sustainable development. Labour's international development team is about working with people in the global south and people in the UK to really build that sense of global solidarity. We've set up a climate justice network to put that intention into action. We've been reaching out to those people and communities in the global south who are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis to understand the position that they are in and determine how the UK should be working accordingly to address these problems collectively. We are committed to working with and harnessing the power, the reach and expertise of faith-based and religious organisations and communities to understand our similarities and our shared goals, to ensure that no one is left behind. This won't be easy, and we know we need to work with people and organisations of all faiths and none to pursue a much safer, better and fairer world. It will be challenging, but I truly believe that it is possible. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Preet. I think there were some really key words there, wasn't it, about working together, about being people focused. And I know a lot of the organisations on this call are specifically people focused and looking at what they're doing on the ground, particularly, and also a general challenge for us all. I think they're a call to action, a call to be somewhat louder, I think, in calling out injustice and actually saying there needs to be a better programme in place, and just to remind ourselves of what's going on, I think, outside of our own patch at times as well. So thank you very much for that, and we'll, I'm sure, go into that much deeper in a moment. I'd like to first, sorry, I've got a massive firework display outside. I'd like to first go over to our panelists and ask them to each introduce themselves, their organisation, and one thing that they would really like as a kind of top priority that their organisation would like to share or would like to see Labour be involved in. So I think I'll go through my screen as I see people, but with Tufail, do you want to start, please? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Good evening, peace be upon you all. Thank you to Christians on the left for organising this very important dialogue and for inviting us. Even before the pandemic, over 800 million people were estimated to be food insecure, with approximately 150 million suffering crisis levels of hunger and famine. The secondary economic impact of the pandemic threatens to push millions more to the brink of starvation. The World Health Organization estimates that those experiencing crisis levels of hunger will rise to a staggering 270 million this year, meaning that up to 12,000 people per day could die from hunger before the end of 2020. Islamic Relief works in some of the worst affected countries, including Yemen, where over half the population, around 14 million, are dependent on food aid. An estimated 85,000 children under the age of 5 have died from starvation and malnutrition in Yemen. We've been helping to feed around 2 million people per month in Yemen. Unfortunately, due to reduction in funding because of the pandemic, since April, these food baskets have reduced in size and now only cover 30% of nutritional needs. The pandemic is a wake-up call. Our current efforts are clearly not working. This is why we, as Islamic Relief, are calling for urgent action to combat the hunger crisis. Labour must push for better funding for humanitarian responses and ensure the UK's aid budget continues to prioritise the world's most vulnerable. Climate change is one of the main causes of food insecurity. To give small-scale food producers the chance to adapt, we must support ambitious policies to dramatically cut emissions and avoid global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius. In many of the countries that we operate in, ongoing conflict is the main cause of food insecurity. In Yemen, 5 years of that conflict has exposed the population to the worst effects of famine, as I've already briefly mentioned. And we welcome Labour's ongoing support for a global ceasefire. Conflict prevention and resolution must be at the heart of any post-pandemic foreign policy.
Thank you very much for that, Tufail. And I think with all of these, as you set out your priorities, I think we'll be wanting to come back to these, and I'm sure Preet will want to respond as well. So next, I'd like to go to Mark Sheard. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Heather. Yes, I'm Mark Sheard. I'm the CEO of World Vision. As I'm sure you will know, World Vision is inspired by our Christian faith and is the world's largest child-focused international charity. We work in nearly 100 countries across the world, implementing humanitarian response, development and advocacy activities. By working with people of all faiths and none, children, their communities, supporters and partners, we believe that the lives of the world's most vulnerable children can be transformed. As has already been observed, COVID-19 is creating new challenges throughout the world, and the secondary impacts are particularly devastating for children. The pandemic is setting back progress on children's education, health and protection by up to a decade. For example, the UN believes that 13 million extra girls will be married over the next decade, and we estimate that at least 4 million of these marriages will happen in the next 2 years. That's a frightening number per day. The UK has now got a basic decision to make. What role will it play in the long-term global recovery from COVID-19 and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? Do we really have that vision to be a global Britain? At World Vision, we believe we must have that, and that building back better must be more than just a catchphrase. The pandemic provides the prospect for a new way of working to address long-held inequalities and create better opportunities for the next generation. To achieve these aims, we look forward to Labour's contribution. Labour's vision for development should put at its heart an ambitious agenda for children. Recovery should start with a global vision for children that puts them at the heart of building resilience to future shocks and ending aid dependency. Living up to existing commitments for children and going further to be a leading global champion, not only for education, but also for preventable child deaths. and protecting children from violence and exploitation. Our future lies with children and young people, and the world's most challenging issues will only be solved in partnership with them. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. I know that we'll definitely want to be coming back to that. In particular, I might want to ask a chair's prerogative question around children, and something that Preet mentioned in the Westminster Hall debate on Rohingya, particularly on education and priorities around that. We now go to Dr. Ruth Valerio, please.
Thank you. And good evening, everybody. It's really lovely to see such a good turnout this evening and to see the fireworks, as well as to hear them. So I'm from Tearfund. I'm the Global Advocacy and Influencing Director. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Tearfund, we are a Christian aid, development and advocacy organisation. We work with and through the local church in around 50 countries to tackle poverty and respond to disasters. The coronavirus pandemic has disrupted the world and impacted all of our lives, but the climate crisis threatens an even greater disruption. At Tearfund, we've been working on climate issues for well over 20 years now, and it is very important to us that we ensure that the post-COVID economic recovery in the UK also tackles the climate crisis. And we need to look outwards and we need to act globally to make sure that the recovery in developing countries creates a better world for people in poverty and creates a better world that allows the natural world to flourish. One of the ways that we can do that is to lead by example and to support a managed transition away from fossil fuels globally. And this is one of the things that we are calling for as Tearfund, alongside a number of other organisations. We need to transition away from financing fossil fuels if we are going to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And we believe that developing countries should be given the opportunities that we have for cleaner growth and for accessing the falling price of renewables. So the UK government can help this transition, this overall transition away from fossil fuels onto renewable energy by ending new public financing for fossil fuels overseas, both ODA and non-ODA. We're calling on them to phase out existing investments and then rapidly scale up support for renewable energy, for energy efficiency and energy access for the poorest countries. The good news is that we've heard that the Prime Minister is considering this decision, and we urge him and want to ask Labour to urge him to now take the positive step and to announce this soon. The UK's overseas fossil fuel support runs into billions of pounds. It, of course, exacerbates climate change. It locks developing countries into high carbon pathways, and it harms our own international development and climate goals. So a green recovery from COVID-19 can't only be within the UK borders. We need to look more widely, because climate change doesn't stop at borders. We are at a turning point, and the decisions that we make now will shape the world for decades.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And again, I think a great call to action again for us all, and some points that I think we all need to look at and remember in terms of our own response and what we're doing with that, and particularly to hold the government to account on that green recovery as well. So thank you very much for raising that. And I think now we have Patrick Watt. Can go to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Heather, and great to see so many people participating in this conversation this evening, and I think it couldn't be, as Preet was saying earlier, more timely. So my name is Patrick Watt. I'm the Policy, Public Affairs and Campaigns Director at Christian Aid. Christian Aid does what it says on the tin. It's the agency working on ending global poverty of the UK churches, working in about 25 countries around the world, established in 1945, and with long-standing support from our sponsoring churches, the Protestant, Reformed and Orthodox churches here in the UK and in Ireland. So I was going to speak briefly about an issue that Preet touched upon in her speech, which I think is really critical to building back better. It's critical both to the way that the poorest countries are able to respond now to the impact of COVID, but it's also critical to their longer term prospects of recovery and of building back better, and that's the issue of debt. And debt relief is one of the quickest ways, one of the most effective ways of getting resources to some of the poorest countries to enable them to strengthen their healthcare, to provide social protection, and to weather the worst economic effects of the crisis. Unfortunately, the situation we're in at the moment is that the debt deal on the table for the poorest countries is woefully inadequate. The G20 made a deal in May. It was extended in recent weeks for another 6 months, but it's a debt standstill deal. Essentially what it does is it rolls over the debt, it kicks the can down the road for a group of countries for whom these debts were already unpayable before the COVID crisis struck. So what's happened since the crisis has struck is that, of course, as economies have dramatically shrunk, government revenues have fallen, Africa is seeing its first recession since 1995, those unpayable debts have ballooned in volume. And the opportunity cost for people in poverty, therefore, of those debt repayments has spiraled. So we're seeing the terrible cost of the debt burden, in effect, is tying one hand behind the back of the poorest countries as they seek to respond to COVID. We're seeing 64 countries at least spending more on their debt service repayments than they are on healthcare in the midst of arguably the gravest health crisis we've seen since HIV and AIDS. And of course, failure to tackle that debt crisis with a comprehensive debt workout is going to deepen the economic and social cost of the pandemic now, and therefore it's going to slow any recovery in the future. The UK's got a really important role to play in fixing this problem. Unlike the last debt crisis, a very large proportion of the debts are now with China and with commercial creditors. But ultimately, any debt workout is going to have to be coordinated by the international financial institutions. The World Bank has a leading stake, a leading share in those institutions, and a powerful voice on the boards. And Labour has an important role to play in applying pressure in Parliament on the UK Treasury to play a full and constructive role in driving to a debt solution. I think more broadly, we need to be looking at how we avoid future irresponsible lending that puts countries in this kind of situation. And to do that, I think we need to be reviving and revisiting the idea of debt jubilee that mobilised so many members of the UK public in the year 2000, including many members of the Labour movement. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I actually remember, I think the Jubilee debt relief campaign might have been one of the first things that I personally got involved in. I know my parents were very involved with, and how prominent that was in much of our minds and thinking, particularly for people of faith that got involved in that and felt very mobilised and very equipped, I think, to speak out at the time on that. So thank you for raising that. And I think some very important points that each of you has made in turn. I'd like to go back to Preet, if it's all right. We're going to start a fairly open discussion, and I don't know, Preet, if there's anything specifically that you would want to pull out of what you've heard, but I might actually just start with a kind of shares prerogative on that and just say, considering we've heard so many different areas, whether that's tackling global hunger, the Yemen climate change, our distraction through, we could say, COVID and what we're doing about climate on that, through to debt and children as well. How do we manage all of this, particularly during this time, particularly when political focus is pulled in so many different areas, when we're looking at home towards things potentially like unemployment and recession, How do we keep these on the agenda? How do we keep pushing? And how do we keep the public attention on these areas? So over to you, Preet.
Really important question, because all of the issues that you raised are so important. And whilst, yes, of course, there's a global pandemic, and yes, we need to make sure that there is cooperation, especially when we have a vaccine available. It's got to be mass manufactured and distributed, and that's going to require heads of states really coming together. The problem that we're all going to actually have, though, is about how do we use our voice to hold this government to account? Because as you all know, the Secretary of State announced 2.9 billion cuts ahead of summer recess. None of us know actually the detail of those cuts. So we have been submitting parliamentary questions. We've been pretty much drip fed as to what those cuts look like. And of course, the secondary impacts of COVID, the very things that you talk about, the fact that 500 million people will be pushed into poverty, that food security is a big issue, there's conflict that is taking place. There's, the solidarity piece around actually domestic abuse that we've seen in the United Kingdom, where actually violence against women and girls has increased. And it really concerns me that the government hasn't made a commitment about having an effective scrutiny mechanism. Labour have been actually pushing the government much further. I mean, we feel that there should be an ODA scrutiny committee, because many of you will know that 30% of ODA money gets spent by other government departments. And actually, it all needs to be held, to account in terms of how that money is actually giving value for taxpayers' money. So I think there is a lot more that we need to do. And this is why today the challenge is not just to the sector, the challenge is to politicians, it's to civil society, it's to diaspora communities, it's to faith organizations. We've got to use our voice. We've got to be speaking up for the world's poorest, because, this is a government that actually, what we've seen here is retreating from the world stage. This idea, and it talks about the rhetoric of global Britain and its place in the world. Well, actually, it needs to be driving the kind of response globally. It hasn't really pretty much done that. It's pretty much outsourced lots of its responsibility to multilateral systems. And whether we touch on any one of those issues, if thinking about the last Labour administration that was in power, you would have seen them rallying around heads of states, bringing them together, putting pressure on the G20 to end the debt crisis. It's not good enough that we are just kicking the can down the road. Absolutely right. But I think it's much more than that. It's really dismantling some of those conditions that are based on debt, for example, because actually for many countries in the global south, there are conditions that don't allow them to invest in public services as a condition of that debt. And that is absolutely not right. It's the very thing I'm really passionate about how do we get that investment? How do we bring together the idea of health security? How do we build resilience? Because this won't be the only pandemic that we face. And, we cannot allow what's currently happening. We don't know what is going to be the economic and the health impact in terms of recovery. The challenges are ahead of us for the whole world, not just the UK, are huge. They're absolutely huge. And this idea that we suddenly become insular and we start to protect our own, and we've seen lots of developed countries actually buying up vaccines, for example. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work trying to push, the government in terms of patent pools. But, again, this is a government that just says that it's committed about development, but actually it is not showing that. And of course, when you get rid of a department which is world leading, you are going to spend a lot of your time focused on what's happening internally in Whitehall. And, that is exactly what the government is focused on, the restructuring of staff, people finding their place, figuring out how this works, because we have ambassadors in new roles. All the while, we have a global pandemic, we have people dying, we have conflict, we have secondary impacts. And so actually the onus is on all of us to hold the government in account. It's to use our voices. It's to be calling upon our faith leaders at the right time to be speaking out on behalf of the world's poorest and really raising the issues. I mean, when I met with many of you, and all of the work that you are doing, it's really commendable. But the challenge I put then was, where is the Marcus Rashford for development? And I think that challenge exists for all of us, because it's not just, it's got to be non-partisan actors talking about these issues. And no more do I want us to feel that actually, if we talk about development, if we talk about how important it is, not just from a moral perspective, but we are internationalists, that somehow the British public won't like that, or they won't want to contribute. I don't buy that. I buy that the fact that we've got to find ways to absolutely make a difference. We've got to have those difficult conversations. We've got to build that global solidarity piece. And I absolutely believe we can do it. It's something I'm really committed to changing. And that's why I think the wider engagement we have, not just with the sector, actually with elected members on the ground, with diaspora communities, with civil society groups. For me, the broader engagement of building that coalition of support here in the United Kingdom, but across the world around wide development has got to be important. And that's why I'm really pleased that CARE has retained a separate department for development and hasn't mirrored what the government has done, because we absolutely believe that there's got to be the separation of diplomacy and from development priorities.
Great, thank you for that, Preet. I think that was very strong and very welcome, I think, to hear, and particularly in the way that I think faith organisations should be calling out, are calling out at times, and perhaps might need to keep finding their voice, particularly during this time. And it's also good to hear you talk about the structure of DFID and that CARE has committed to doing that. And I think a lot of us would be welcoming that on this call, particularly. And also about accountability and scrutiny, which I think many of us are generally worried about in terms of how that can keep occurring and going on in good faith, we'd say, as well within that. I just want to quickly go back to our panel, and particularly to Patrick. When you were talking, we'll just go back to these ideas of debt relief and back to the idea of a new jubilee. I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit in terms of how Labour might be championing that. And I know that Preet has just covered an awful lot there in terms of how we marry up some of those problems that are going on around the world, but in particular, how do we embrace that again? What does that involve? Yeah, I'm just going to hand back over to you, Patrick.
Sure. No, thanks for that question. I mean, I think if there was an easy answer to that challenge, we'd have made more progress than we have. So, I mean, I think we've got to recognise that the debt crisis now is more complicated. I mean, one of the problems with the G20 package at the moment is that it's actually freed up some resources to just enable countries to continue to pay their commercial creditors. You know, in that sense, it hasn't necessarily freed up the fiscal space for those countries to respond to COVID in the way that they need to. So any debt deal has got to be comprehensive. And for that to happen, we need to be creating the conditions where commercial creditors have to come to the table and take a cut with other creditors. I mean, Preet talked, I think, earlier in her initial speech about the need to close the space for suing for debt recovery under UK law. So most of these commercial debts are actually held under UK law. We ought to be ensuring that countries can't be taken to court for not paying on those debts. So that's a key element. I think a second key element is getting China and the US aligned, because they're the single the two biggest movers really in securing a comprehensive debt deal. One of the reasons actually that the World Bank and IMF have taken a back seat on providing cancellation on their own debts is because actually the key shareholders on the board of the World Bank and IMF, including China and the US, can't agree between themselves. Hopefully, if the election result goes in the way that it's looking, it's going to go over in the US at the moment, we might see some movement on that in the IFIs. But again, the UK has a critical role to play on the World Bank and IMF boards. But I think longer term, what we do need to be pushing for is a completely different approach to finance for the poorest countries. We need to be moving away from unsustainable finance. We need to be moving away from the kind of conditionalities that we heard about that are often imposing failed free market and austerity policies on the poorest countries. And we need to be creating conditions for countries to access more concessional finance, including aid that enables them to actually work their way out of poverty without creating an unsustainable burden. So it's going to be a process, not an event. But I do think that civil society pressure and parliamentary pressure on this agenda is really crucial. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Did you want to come back at all on that, Preet?
Yeah, I think Patrick made an excellent point, because, you know, development goes beyond aid, and picking up on the debt issue, he's absolutely right. And for me, it's about how do we lobby for the legislative change, that unilateral decision that we can make around private creditors here, not being able to sue those countries. But I think he touched on a really important point about what we do as we go forward, because it's about those relationships, and those relationships have been very much one-sided in terms of what is the priorities of those countries in terms of what they need, and what is the investment, and therefore what are those loans look like, and how do we make sure that those British companies that are based in the global south actually pay the tax in those countries and don't extract resources out of them. And, you know, so there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done. I'm really pleased that actually Annalise is really committed to that, and we've had lots of conversations. I know she's been meeting with the sector as well to really hear about the concerns, and I think there's a real good piece that we can do. We need to have policy coherence as well. Really important that we work cross government departments, because it isn't just about development, it's about other government departments and their commitments that they've got to make overall to how we absolutely make sure development has a real opportunity, countries have a real chance, and actually the money goes where it's going to make the real difference. And of course, I mean, you know, I've always been, and one thing that I'm focused on is that we've got to see the investment in public services. It isn't right that we have, you know, the NHS here. It isn't right that we have a great system around public service investment, even though that, you know, the impact of austerity in the last 10 years has really pretty much crippled that. Actually, why is it that other countries don't have the right to have those same you know, exports from us? Absolutely, you know, we need to be exporting the best that we have. And again, around climate, it's about that just transition, it's about the mitigation, it's about holding the government to account on fossil fuel investments, but it's also about, we have some world-leading institutions, it's about the collaboration that we do. How do we export that knowledge? How do we show things that will work so we can bypass, you know, the very kind of process that we've had to go through in terms of the industrial revolution, and in terms of what the possible opportunities are for the future around energy. There is so much to do, especially ahead of COP26. I would say, you know, there's been conversation around carbon taxes. It's something that we as a team are starting to really think about ahead of COP26, sorry, about what is it that we want to see the UK lead on and galvanise other countries to be leading on. I think that, you know, your input as well from the sector will be really keen to make sure that we are really pushing your priorities as well as ours. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Preet, for that. And I'm actually really glad you just brought up COP as well. I didn't want to touch on it. I was trying to avoid the US election as much as possible. But with the potential for, let's just say, a Biden administration, let's go there. What do we see? Did we see that as more hopeful than what's happening at the moment? I particularly want to bring in Ruth on this, particularly with climate, and also Tufail on the issue of hunger, because we often know that different drivers of hunger, climate being very much one of those particularly, and the effects of that. But also in terms, and I think you touched on it already, Ruth, and particularly about COVID just being maybe perhaps that distraction during this time. Are you more hopeful, Ruth, if we get a Biden administration? You know, let's just hope for a Labour government at some point as well, but you know, we'll go forward with that. What can we do more around climate, and Tufail particularly, what can we be doing more around the issues to do with hunger? So maybe we'll go to Ruth actually first.
Thank you. Well, you may well know that the US has just come out of the Paris Agreement, and Biden is saying that he would take the US back in. So that immediately offers more hope. And we have seen a strange time in terms of COVID distracting us from issues of climate and the environment. And it's been a bit of a mixed bag. So, you know, if I can look back before the pandemic, you'll remember we were seeing increasing momentum, particularly around plastic and around climate change. And we were seeing declarations of climate emergencies, moves towards net zero, and so much momentum was building. And then the pandemic came in, and it rightly has taken centre stage in recent months. And of course, we've seen COP26 pushed back to a year, and it felt like all the hard work that was building up to that had gone. but then maybe it's a positive thing too, to give us that extra time to work towards it. So COVID has rightly taken centre stage, but we know that we can't afford only to focus on COVID. And the climate crisis is a long-term and ongoing crisis, but it threatens even greater disruption. And the pandemic actually has shown us that you can't separate out the environment from issues of the economy and human development. You have to hold those things together. And when we have an environmental crisis, it leads to an economic and a social crisis. So we know that we're on course for global temperature rises that are putting millions of lives at risk, including animals as well, and seeing that devastation of biodiversity and nature. And we know that, as with the pandemic, it's the poorest countries who are being hit the hardest, and the poorest communities, which is why we're calling on the government to put in place an economic stimulus package that puts climate and puts fairness and equality right at the heart of what it does. On the positive, there is a positive. We have seen a deeper reconnection actually with the natural world. Many people have reported the impact that has been had as people have been out for their once a day and gone for a walk. And really, I think we have learned to appreciate the natural world maybe more than we did before. So possibly this is an opportunity that we can use to mobilize people and to build a movement that doesn't take us back to the old normal, but takes us on to a better future. And at Tearfund, we've joined with the Climate Coalition, and we've joined with them around a declaration that calls on the UK government to lead the world in delivering a greener, fairer recovery. And this is something that we can all work on together.
Thanks very much for that, Ruth. And I think I was just going to bring in Tufail there. Is there anything that you would like to come in particularly around, I think, what Ruth has raised and what has been raised throughout the session so far, particularly in relation to hunger, and also on building on what Ruth has said around climate as well?
Yeah. So COVID has led to a dramatic global economic slowdown, and that's only unfortunately going to get worse. We see on our own doorstep the suffering of people as a result of COVID-19, and it's very easy for us to start looking inwards, to try and to prioritize issues here at home. But we have to remember that globally, those that were already extremely vulnerable before are at greater risk now as a result of COVID-19. You know, globally, to use Yemen as an example, you know, they don't have income or social support. Recently, you know, again, just to give an example of the level of suffering there, in Hajjaj, where people were boiling leaves to try and sort of, you know, quench that thirst, the hunger. We have, as a result of a reduction in funding, we've had to close our feeding program in that region, which was taking care of 23,000 people. What's going to happen now with those people? You know, what is their fate? And you know, I've already given that alarming stat that was shared by Save the Children, 85,000 children that have unfortunately died because of starvation and malnutrition in Yemen. It's only going to get worse. And it's therefore upon us, it's our responsibility to ensure that we keep them in mind. And therefore we need to ensure that, you know, we must prioritize the support of humanitarian aid. That's vital to ensuring that we save lives. In any chaotic situation, in any difficulty, as Ruth mentioned very briefly, there is an opportunity. And there's an opportunity for us to be innovative. You know, because of climate change, you know, we as aid organizations know that we have to do everything that we can to try and obviously, you know, help reduce the effects of climate change. But we also have to help people, you know, small scale farmers, to adapt their practices. So, you know, sharing drought-resistant crops, practices. There are in Africa, in Mali, we've got this innovative program where flash flooding, 6 months of rainfall falls within 2 to 3 days. I saw that in Sudan, where I was just recently, and it's just destroyed that country. And this flash flooding leads to loss of life, destruction of crops, homes. We found a way to harness that opportunity by creating micro dams. Those micro dams allow enough water to be harnessed to provide water for that local community for 6 months and beyond, for most of the dry period. So there is an opportunity for us to be innovative and to change the way that people live their lives, so that they can live in dignity and work their way out of poverty with dignity.
Thank you very much, Tufail. I mean, just want to open it up a little bit. Mark or Preet, did you want to add to that or come back in?
Yeah, just to pick up on what Ruth said, I mean, I think absolutely, if Biden wins, then it absolutely gives us hope. It goes beyond just then what the US is going to make as commitment. It's then the relationship it's going to have. It's how it galvanizes that support. It's how it brings people with it as opposed to against it. Because I mean, we've not just seen around withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, but actually the attacks on the WHO that the US has been making, that hasn't really been helpful. And I think, we need to be showing the solidarity. I mean, some of the work that I've been doing as chair of the APBG for British Sikhs is we had a farmers event, a conference about what's happening in India around showing solidarity to farmers, because actually there are many families that own less than 2 acres of land. It's not only their livelihoods, but they are being thrust at the hands of big corporations, and we've seen rates of farmer suicides increase in parts of the world. And of course, this is all because laws are being passed during COVID-19, which means that there's no consultation and there's no consideration of the impact that it's going to have on people's lives. And that is absolutely going to be catastrophic. And I think one of the things that I want to say is there's a real commitment from the Labour front bench, and that's why we set up the Climate Network, because we absolutely want to engage. We want to engage from the grassroots up, and we want to listen, and we want to hear the impact, because when it comes to forming policy, it's really got to have that rich voices, the diversity of voices that form part of what it is that we want to see change, and how we bring people with us, as opposed to people feeling, because let's be clear, lots of people don't understand the importance of climate and the language that we use, and I think it's so important we break some of this down, but we include those actors on the ground as well. So thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Preet. Mark, I just actually wanted to bring you in a little bit more, particularly around, we had some questions before around education, particularly, and children, and I want to relate that particularly to the work you've been doing specifically around the Rohingya. Do you want to kind of embellish a little bit on what you were starting to talk about with us?
Let's try again. I've just been given permission to unmute, which is great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really happy to elucidate on that. Perhaps I could just add another little comment on the climate issue as well before we go any further. I think sometimes we lose sight of the impact that climate change has on vulnerable children, and that's obviously where I'm coming from. As you see the impact of climate change affect household incomes, as Preet was just talking about, the small areas, then it's perhaps no surprise that children are the ones that get particularly victimised there. Wherever we see the impact of climate change impacting family and households, we see a significant increase in child protection risks, forced labour, begging, other forms of abuse and violence, and particularly child marriage, as I mentioned earlier. And that, of course, leads us into the challenge of refugee camps and education and so on. And what happens there is, once again, is the children who are at the most vulnerable. Very often, perhaps I could just share a little bit of a story, rather than us just deal in abstracts and big number statistics. So I just want to tell you a little thing about a young person called Jacob, who is now in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and had to flee across the Naf River into Bangladesh for safety. Jacob there it tells the story about in Myanmar, I used to go to school. I was in grade 2 when we left. I studied Burmese literature in our class. And when we came here, we had nothing much to do. I stayed at home mostly. And what one instantly finds is children that are not in those safe places are the ones that are most vulnerable. And so on. So in terms of education within refugee camps, and I'll stick with Cox's Bazar, World Vision opened its first child-friendly space near Jacob's home. We're now running dozens of child-friendly spaces for children aged 5 to 12 in the camps. We've got thousands enrolled in centres. Child-friendly spaces offer more than just formal education. They're safe, fun places where children can learn to play and to regain a sense of normality in their disrupted lives. Of course, the problem we're also facing is that children grow up, if I can say that. I mean, and many of the 70 million refugees that are now, the UN now reports, in camps and displaced people. If one looks at Syria, for example, they may have been there for 8 or 9 years. So an 8-year-old who went there is still in a camp is now 17 or so. So we've been developing not only child-friendly spaces, but adolescent-friendly spaces, spaces where young people can be learning the trades and the skills that can make them economically viable when they're able to get back home. So I could talk at much greater length here, but I think the risks are just, what we're seeing is children deprived of a future, and a future needs to be safe. It needs to be a place where they can learn. It needs to be a place where they can build a future for themselves, and that's what we aim to do.
Thanks, Mark. There was actually a question in the chat from Esther Timpson, I think it was. He said the issue of child marriage was mentioned. Are Labour and the aid sector behind the Girls Not Brides campaign? And it's impossible, she says, to advocate for the end of child marriage globally when it's still allowed at times here in the UK. So I don't know, Preet, if you want to come in on that at all, or Mark as well, particularly.
Yeah, and I just wanted to come and touch up on Mark's issue as well. I think, you know, absolutely right. Of course, we support the initiatives that are taking place around the world around child marriage. But of course, a lot of this is also about addressing stigma and stereotypes that exist within cultures. And how do we absolutely get into that? So who has the role? Who is the best placed person? Is it faith organizations? Is it faith leaders? Because of course, they have a huge amount of power in terms of, you know, being able to sort of really shift and break some of this down. But of course, we've got to support those organizations and agencies that don't always get government support in other parts of the world, that they are silenced, and actually they're, you know, it's much tougher for them to be speaking up against some of these atrocities. So yeah, absolutely committed to ending child marriage and doing all that we can do to really support some of those initiatives. Just coming back on Mark's point, I think, you know, absolutely right. There's about 326,000 Rohingya children in need of education in Cox's Bazar. And I had the great honour and the fortune, you know, to actually visit one of World Vision's child-friendly spaces in Uganda. And Mark is absolutely right, because it wasn't just a place of education. You know, there were peace clubs. You know, these are refugees fleeing from conflict in Sudan. They've seen their families killed along the journey. Imagine what the emotional, the psychological impact of that is like, seeing, you know, child households. I was really, really inspired and encouraged, because actually that's when you see the value of our taxpayers' money in terms of what it is actually doing and what it inspires to do. And, you know, just to echo Mark's point, we cannot see a lost generation of children in any of these camps. And, you know, that is the tragedy. That is really what we are facing. And so we've got to do what we can to absolutely support education in these camps, as Mark has rightly said. It's great to see so many organisations like World Vision and others really leading on that charge. So thank you.
I wonder, could I pop in there as well? And I think it's raised a really important point that the Preet has just raised around the role of faith leaders and faith-based organisations right in the local community, because they hold that high degree of trust and influence, and often the knowledge that faith leaders have of their local cultural and economic and social norms is indispensable. One of the programmes that we're running at Tearfund is called Transforming Masculinities, which seeks to address the very issues that we've just been touching on. And we work with faith leaders, particularly church leaders, and reaching out into the male members of the communities in order to change their understanding so that we will reduce domestic violence and issues around child brides. That we've seen something like 800 faith leaders trained, reaching 6,000 people in a whole number of different communities, and have really seen families and young girls and their communities transformed. And that has happened through working very deliberately with faith leaders because of the influence that they hold in their communities.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Ruth. So thank you very much for bringing us in. I think it's a really excellent reminder to us all. I've got another question that's come in, and I'm going to link two of them actually. So one was about how can we build public support for debt relief in the aftermath of the pandemic? And the other question was linked to that was around furlough, particularly in the sense that we have, have we borrowed money to pay for furlough and things like this? So will there be a little bit of difficulty in persuading public about debt relief, particularly about aid? So I think you touched on this actually in your opening speech, Preet, so maybe we'll come back to you for that. And then also perhaps we can bring in all of our panel as well if they wanted to say something specifically around public support for debt relief.
Just on the latter point first, and in terms of our commitments to obviously the economic impact here in the United Kingdom, let's not forget that we have the 0.7% commitment in legislation, so that is protected. Of course, there will be a fall in GNI, so we do expect some reduction, but as we've been calling that the government should actually reduce that spend, which doesn't have little or no impact in terms of poverty reduction, that is being spent by other government departments, that's being rated as not being effective in terms of, its effectiveness in terms of reducing poverty and meeting some of those development priorities. On debt relief, I think, look, many have said it actually today, and the Jubilee Debt Campaign is so well known today. I think there's a need to revive, there's a need to have a new Jubilee Debt Campaign, and that means all of us collectively coming together, making sure the language we use, the asks that we have, how we engage civil society. Let's not forget, people in this in Britain are hugely supportive of charity work, whether that's their local charities on their high streets, whether that's giving to causes, and people want to make a difference. I mean, there's been some really good polling, especially around the vaccine, for example, and absolutely the British public is right behind us in terms of making sure that there's equitable access to that vaccine to the world's poorest, because of course travel will be a huge concern and a huge issue for us. So I think there is, it is down to us really. Like I said, it's about how we bring those campaigns, how we build them, how we engage people locally. It's the actors we use that absolutely convey that message. No longer those messages of seeing a child, facing hunger or wanting food. They don't work. It's about really understanding what is it that really drives the British public to come behind a campaign. It's about people they identify with. It's the people that speak their language. And I absolutely believe there is a need for a campaign around debt relief. I'm really excited and pleased that so many people are raising it. So there's the offer from me about let's work together and let's put something together and let's create a campaign. We need more social movements, not just here, but across the global south as well. Absolutely.
Great, thanks, Preet. And knowing everybody on this call, I'm pretty sure they'll be getting in contact with you about those campaigns. So yeah, thank you very much for that. We've had a question as well, and perhaps it runs parallel to working with different agencies particularly, and that's within Labour's plan. Is there a role for the private sector to play a driving force in change, and particularly in progressing recovery around the strategic development goals? So I just wondered if you might want to speak into the role of the private sector.
Absolutely. I think, look, Jack McConnell, who co-chairs the APPG for Sustainable Goals, has been doing some fantastic work. There's an absolute role for private sector. I'm really keen that they have to play their part. And I think, in terms of how they perform against the Sustainable Development Goals is something that actually I went to an event and saw lots of businesses partake in it, many already doing that work in terms of really showing and evidencing how they're making a difference, where they source their products from, what those supply chains look like, but actually there's a lot more to do, and it's not everybody, as you rightly know that. So I think, yeah, I think there is a role for the private sector. It's something definitely we are committed to looking at what that is. I think there's already some really good work. It's about building on that.
And if I can jump in again, as Preet will know, one of the things that the private sector needs is stability, and to know what the government policies are for the long term, so that they feel confident to invest in particular directions. And we saw that changing with renewable energy as that went up and then went back down again, and those who had invested in that sector then didn't know what was happening. So we need the government to be sending out strong messages, strong signals that the private sector can really put their money behind renewable energy and move out of fossil fuels, and that they can do that with security and confidence.
Great, thank you, Ruth. And on that, Ruth, I might actually keep you on the line a minute, because we just had the question that basically says, is growing population still seen as contributing to climate change? So I might throw that your way, Ruth. So.
Well, yes and no. So growing population is contributing to climate change, but we also have to be very careful with that, because we know that levels of consumption are not equal around the world. So forgive me, I haven't got the exact figures in my mind, but we know that a child that I'm bringing up here in the UK will consume something like 16 times the amount of resources, or whatever the figure is, of a child in Bangladesh. So population growth is a concern, and it is something that we need to tackle. For many years, it was the elephant in the room and was a topic that people didn't want to talk about. But we have to hold that hand in hand with tackling poverty, with the issues that we've already touched on around women and young girls, and then education, and hold that hand in hand with the consumption levels of those of us in the more economically developed nations. So it needs to be part of a wider conversation.
Great, thank you, Ruth. I think as we're coming quite close to an end, I should probably sort of start wrapping it up and let people go for drinks and things. But we've had quite a few questions in. I know that we'll try and get back to some of you. I might forward some of these questions on to Joe in Preet's office, or to our panelists as well. And there were various discussions around domestic violence, what's happening there, provisions around housing, particularly in developing nations. We've also had some great ideas about getting together a sort of faith network to keep the momentum around this. Is there some way that we can be reaching out to one another? So that might be one for Louise, our director, to have a think about as well, probably with poor Gareth, who's also on this call. And other questions around Labour reaching out to red wall seats, and how we keep that messaging. And I know, Preet, that you've spoken quite a lot about that on other calls. So in terms of what Labour is doing there. Just before we kind of wrap it up and I give my thanks, is there anything else from our panelists, the one thing that they'd really want to see Preet doing? Just going to land it at your doorstep, Preet, but is there any other comments from our panelists before we wrap up? Mark raised his hand, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to thank you and Preet for putting this event on. I think it's been truly inspiring to hear Preet talk with such passion and so on. And I'm sure I speak for all my colleagues on the panel that at a time when the government doesn't seem terribly interested in working with NGOs, and doesn't seem to recognise the value and the expertise that we bring and the reach that we bring, is truly a privilege to be able to be at this type of event. I think I'm sure, again, if my colleagues on the panel will forgive me, I'm speaking for them when I say we'd love to work collaboratively. We do a tremendous amount of work already collaboratively, both here in the UK and in the field. And we would certainly respond very positively to any initiative and encouragement from Labour to work with them on that. So thanks very much.
Great. I think I had Ruth's hand up as well, and then Patrick, I think, and Tufail as well. Yeah, Ruth.
No, it was fine. I put up the clapping reaction.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Just to
Looked
say,
at me like I had.
yeah, no, I don't need to prolong this, just to say thank you very much. It's been really good to be with you and to meet you all in this way.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Patrick.
I mean, maybe just to say that having champions in Parliament like Preet is incredibly important, particularly at a time when the government seems to be looking inward more than outwards, and pulling back from many of Britain's commitments on tackling poverty and international development. And I think, you know, there are some really big choices as we come through this pandemic and we come to the end of the transition period of Brexit, and we're renegotiating in many ways Britain's relationship with the rest of the world. There's some really big choices about Britain playing a positive role in tackling poverty and tackling injustice, playing a progressive role in the world for a greener world, a world of shared prosperity, a world of peace and security. And I think strong progressive voices advocating for that agenda are absolutely needed. So very much look forward to collaborating in the future on that.
Great. Tufail.
I echo what my colleagues have said. Preet, great to see your passion, and you speak so eloquently about these very important issues that that impact lives across the world. Let's make Jubilee Debt 2 happen, God willing. You have us on board.
Thank you. Preet, any closing thoughts from you?
Just to say, honestly, it is a real privilege and a real honour to be doing this brief, because, you know, I get to hear about the amazing stories and the impact of all the work that the sector is doing, and especially everybody on this call. It's really, really heartening just to see the kind of, you know, welcome that you've also given me in this role. I'm still learning. You know, there is a lot to do. You never get tired of reading about some of the amazing stuff that you can do in the innovation, and I'm really, really passionate, but I'm also really committed to listening, to engaging, and to working with you collaboratively on the kind of key issues. And so when we do policy in the future, we will have task force. Your voice is going to be important. But equally, it's the grassroots voice, it's civil society, it's those that it's going to impact, it's the decisions that we make here. And I want to have a partnership approach in terms of how we work forward and the kind of challenges ahead of us that are going to require a lot of innovation, but a lot of coming together. And we need to see that kind of cooperation and collaboration on the world stage in a way that we just haven't seen. And it's really been disheartening to see that the way this government is really behaving. But probably my final point really would be on the point that Patrick made, is we've got to have a collective strong voice. You know, if we can't constantly tiptoe around this government and we worry about what the impact of that is going to be, you know, I think we will look back on this time and we will think, why did we not do more? Why did we not speak out more? Why did we not bring people together? And I don't think we need to worry about people in red wall seats. I think what we need to think about is actually, how do we get them on board? There's lots of polling that we want to do. There are lots of organisations that are looking at red wall seats and what kind of messaging actually works in terms of development priorities and the work that we want to do. And of course, protecting the 0.7 commitment is going to be really important. I think our next challenge is having an effective scrutiny. We've absolutely got to be able to hold this government to account in terms of that spend. We don't know what the future cuts look like. We still don't know what the 2.9 billion looks like. It's really concerning. I don't think any of us have seen an attack on our democracy in the way that we are seeing, not just here, but actually this is a global issue. And so I just want to say thank you so much. It's always wonderful to come to these events because actually they inspire me. I come and I take so much away, and I think Jubilee too. Yes, absolutely. Let's you know, galvanise around that. So thank you so much, and thank you for everybody as well for taking out their evening today and making time.
Thanks very much, Preet. And I think all that is left to do for me is to thank all of our panelists. Thank you to World Vision, Islamic Relief, Christian Aid and Tearfund. And thank you especially to Preet for being on this call and everyone that's helped organise this. I do just want to flag that as Christians on the Left have what's called our Tawny dialogue. That will be on the 11th of January and it's called Families or Factions. Are we cultivating community or harming harmony? That will be with David Lammy, Sam Wells and Dawn Foster. So please look out for that. Everybody is welcome. And you can check that out on the Twitter or the website as well. Thank you very much for a fantastic evening. I also feel incredibly inspired and challenged in many ways. So yeah, once again, I hope you can have the rest of a good evening. And if there are still fireworks going on, stand outside your flat, as I might do in a minute, to watch them. So good night. Thank you. Thanks, Preet.
Great.